Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. This is a Good Night snack episode available exclusively for my housekeeper and butler tier patrons. I felt like I was researching this episode forever. In fact, I still wasn't able to get everything in it that I had originally planned, but at a certain point, I realized I owe you all an episode and I had to cap it somewhere. My problem was that I realized there's this entire subgenre of Victorian-era true crime that I've never really covered before, which is the American Old West, and I wanted to learn more about it. One of my favorite things to do when it comes to historic true crime is to separate fact from fiction. For that reason, I thought what better place is there to focus on than Tombstone, Arizona. So tonight, I bring you part one of Tombstone, Arizona, the town too tough to die. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. Tombstone is a city in the state of Arizona in the southwestern United States. From visitarizona.com, located in the southeast corner of Arizona, Tombstone takes some effort to get to, but the payoff is immediate. Visitors pull into town on dirt roads that lead to infamous historic sites and storefronts captured in time. Actors in period garb mingle with visitors on wooden boardwalks and in saloons with creaky floors. It's located at an elevation of approximately 4,800 feet and is a semi-arid or semi-desert climate, meaning it does rain during part of the year, but mostly it's dry and hot. Winter is dry and sunny with the occasional light snow. Spring is described as quite pleasant and not too hot, but in the summer it gets hot, with temperatures sometimes rising to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But it's a dry heat, as they say. I've never been to the Southwest, so I never quite understood if that's a joke or literal, but 100 degrees sounds pretty hot to me, so you can let me know. July through September are their wet months when monsoon rains move through, usually in the afternoon. In this area, there are many dry washes that flood in this time of year, and visitors are cautioned to take the Do Not Cross When Flooded signs posted very seriously. Before American settlers came to the area, it was occupied, as it had been for centuries, by Native Americans. The area that would become Tombstone and the surrounding areas was later referred to as Apacheria and home to the Chiricahua Apaches. The Chiricahua Apaches had migrated south from Canada along the Rocky Mountains centuries ago. Their trade routes extended from north of the Arkansas River into what are now the northern states of Mexico, and from central Texas through New Mexico to central Arizona. American settlers didn't turn up until about the 1850s. By this time, their encounters with the Chiricahua Apaches were preceded by over 100 years of history with Spanish colonial and Mexican people. American settlers and their views on Native Americans and land and resource management introduced a new layer of complexity to an already tumultuous history. Initially, the Apache were rather ambivalent when it came to the American settlers, and in certain cases even joined forces with them as allies against the Mexicans. Slowly, though, American miners and settlers began to encroach on the Chiricahua Apache territory, and encounters became increasingly more hostile through the 1860s. We all know how this story goes, unfortunately, which is eventually the U.S. Army confined Native Americans to reservation life. Hey everyone, it's Kim, and I wanted to let you know that you're listening to a preview of a Patreon-only series from A Good Night for a Murder called A Good Night Snack. Episodes are released once a month and are only available at the housekeeper and butler tier on Patreon. If you like the Victorian Society tips in the regular episodes, you're probably going to like these. In this series, I focus on profiling famous Victorian people, Victorian lifestyle and society roles, and more historical true crime that may not be enough to build an entire episode out of, but works for a quick Victorian true crime fix. Hence the series name, A Good Night Snack. So if you're enjoying the episode, I'm going to play a little bit more for you right now, but if you want to hear the whole thing and more like it, head over to my website at agoodnightforamurder.com, where you can find the link for my Patreon and join at the housekeeper and butler tier. Now back to the story. The town of Tombstone itself, though, started with a man named Ed Schieffelin, who was a scout for the U.S. Army headquartered at Camp Huachuca. In his free time, Schieffelin would wander outside the camp looking for valuable ore samples like copper or silver. Due to ongoing tensions with the Apaches, though, it was not considered particularly safe to be wandering about outside the camps. When a fellow Army scout learned this was what Schieffelin was up to, he told them, "The only rock you'll find out there will be your own tombstone." After several months, though, he did eventually find a piece of silver in a dry wash on a high plateau called Goose Flats. It took him several more months to locate the vein of silver, but he did. Unfortunately, he was unable to afford filing for a claim on it, so he took on a partner to help finance the claim. Schieffelin remembered how all anyone ever told him was that all he'd find out there was his own tombstone, so on September 3rd, 1877, he named his claim Tombstone. From tombstonechamber.com, word spread quickly about his silver strike. It wasn't long before homesteaders, cowboys, speculators, prospectors, lawyers, business people, and gunmen headed to the area. The town that sprung up around the mine took on the same name of Tombstone, and by the mid-1880s, the town was, quote, booming with 2 dance halls and a dozen gambling spots and more than 20 saloons. Again, from tombstonechamber.com, the popular in Tombstone increased to approximately 7,500 by the mid-1880s. However, this figure only consisted of the white males over the age of 21 that were registered to vote. The figure that consists of women, children, and other ethnicities, the population was at least 15,000 and possibly as much as 20,000. Tombstone was considered to be between San Francisco and St. Louis as the fastest populating city. Tombstone was home to more than 100 saloons, a multitude of eateries, a huge red light district, a larger popular of Chinese, newspapers, churches, schools, and one of the original Arizona community swimming pools, which is still being used today. The bustling boomtown would suffer 2 fires hardly a year apart, though. In June of 1881, a lit cigar ignited a barrel of whiskey in the Arcade Saloon. The fire burned through half of the Eastern Business District, destroying businesses in the process. The citizens rebuilt, but in May 1882, disaster struck again, and this time it would be worse. This fire would destroy over 100 businesses, including the Grand Hotel and the Tivoli Saloon. There was not enough water to fight the flames, so the people of Tombstone resorted to blowing up their own businesses with dynamite in an effort to deny the fire fuel. When all was said and done, the total damages were estimated to be $700,000, far more than the estimated $250,000 insurance coverage. But the town would rebuild again. The resilience and quick bounce back of Tombstone earned it the nickname, "The Town Too Tough to Die." Eventually, the profitable silver mine struck water and began to flood. Mine managers put in huge and expensive pumps to pump water out and keep the mines open, but on May 26, 1886, the pumping plant caught fire and burned. And that would ultimately bring Tombstone's mining days to an end. Residents cleared out in search of opportunity elsewhere, and the town likely would have become a ghost town had it not been designated as the Cochise County seat at the time. Town life was rather quiet clear through the 1940s, but the town received renewed interest in the 1950s and 60s due to portrayals in comics, movies, television, and film. Currently, tourism and Western memorabilia are the main commercial enterprises. A 2020 census count listed the resident population at a humble 1,308, but the town of Tombstone receives approximately 450,000 tourist visitors a year. I always feel like I'm doing a middle school book report when I share history of an area like that. It really is important for the context in the stories we're about to get into, though, which probably would not have been allowed as a middle school book report subject, but it turns out you can grow up, start a podcast, and talk about almost anything you like. So let's get into some of the most famous happenings that occurred in the city of Tombstone, Arizona, starting with what else but the gunfight at the OK Corral. Before this episode, I actually thought the story might be fictitious, but it is not. It happened. The gunfight at the OK Corral has become the epitome of what life was like in the Old West. Justice was swift, harsh, and handled outside the bureaucracies of the law. When it comes to the chain of events that led to the gunfight at the OK Corral, though, the circumstances were far more complex. Political, social, and economic differences that had arisen during the Civil War were still very much present. Tensions also existed between the rural rancher community and those with northern-style big government ideas brought by miners and prospectors. In Tombstone in particular, from okcorral.com, profits from the mines created a business-friendly town center with a pronounced need for law enforcement officers to maintain justice and order. To provide protection and reduce crime and violence, Tombstone's town leaders sought out men like Wyatt Earp, who had built his reputation as a gunfighter and lawman in Dodge City. The history and stories of those involved in the gunfight at the OK Corral would take a whole other podcast to cover completely. It was really a series of smaller events that boiled over on that day. Those involved in the eventual gunfight were 4 representatives of the law and 5 outlaws, or cowboys as they were called. Back then, the term cowboy was really more synonymous with cattle rustler, meaning cattle thieves. Being a cowboy really encompassed any sort of Old West crime, though, like stealing horses and holding up stagecoaches and the like. So the 4 men on the side of the law were Virgil, Wyatt, and Morgan Earp, all brothers, and Wyatt Earp's close friend, Doc Holliday. The 5 cowboys were brothers Ike and Billy Clanton, another set of brothers, Tom and Frank McLaury, and their friend, Billy Claiborne. Basically, there had been a stagecoach robbery and murder where Ike Clanton, one of the cowboys, was said to be planning to give up the names of the robbers to Wyatt Earp. He could cash in on the reward money, and Wyatt Earp. This has been a Goodnight Snack episode from A Good Night for a Murder. To hear the full story and more like it, plus unlock the bonus content that accompanies each regular episode, head on over to my website at agoodnightforamurder.com and sign up for the housekeeper and butler tier on Patreon. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.